All right, it looks like I have 3:01, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining our medical research and COVID-19 series. Just a couple of notes. So first, you can use the Q&A function starting now or at any point throughout the presentation to start submitting your questions along with your name and office, which we will take at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, this briefing is not open to members of the press. So if you've joined us inadvertently, we appreciate your interest, but we would ask that you disconnect at this time. I'm Tanaz Rasooli with the Association of American Medical Colleges and Executive Director of the Ad Hoc Group for Medical Research, a coalition of nearly 400 organizations focused on the National Institutes of Health. We are pleased to be co-hosting this event today with the Coalition for Health Funding, which represents 92 organizations working to strengthen public health investment. Perhaps now more than ever, we are seeing how the nation's investment in NIH-supported medical research across the country has been critical in helping us eliminate COVID-19 and its wide-ranging and even lingering effects. Our organizations launched this series to hear from the directors of NIH's individual institutes and centers about how past and future research can inform our response to the pandemic, sometimes perhaps even in unexpected ways, as well as the impact that COVID is having on existing research across the agency's broad portfolio. We have two moderators for today's briefing. Brittany Meyer is Senior Associate Director of Public Policy at the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research, and she is a Coalition for Health Funding board member and will facilitate the Q&A portion of the discussion. And to introduce our speaker for today's briefing, I will turn things over to Katie Grady, who is Federal Advocacy Manager at the Society for Neuroscience and a member of the Ad Hoc Group for Medical Research Steering Committee. Katie, over to you.
Thanks, Naz. CHF and the Ad Hoc Group are pleased to welcome Dr. Walter Koroshetz, Director of the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, to our 9th event in this series. He joined NINDS in 2007 as Deputy Director and has held a leadership role in a number of NIH and NINDS programs, including the Post-Acute Silique SARS-CoV-2 PASC initiative, the Helping to End Addiction Long-Term Heal initiative, the NIH's Brain Initiative, NIH Blueprint for Neuroscience, the Traumatic Brain Injury Center collaboration between the NIH Intramural and the Uniformed Health Services University, the NIH Office of Emergency Care Research, the Common Fund's Undiagnosed Disease and the Acute to Chronic Pain Transition programs. Before joining NINDS, Dr. Koroshetz served as Vice Chair of the Neurology Service and Director of Stroke and Neuro-Intensive Care Services at Massachusetts General Hospital. He was a professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School and led neurology resident training at Massachusetts General Hospital between 1990 and 2007. Over that same period, he co-directed the Harvard Medical School Neurobiology of Disease course with Drs. Edward Kravitz and Robert H. Brown. A native of Brooklyn, New York, Dr. Koroshetz graduated from Georgetown University and received his medical degree from the University of Chicago. He trained in internal medicine at the University of Chicago and Massachusetts General Hospital. He then trained in neurology and neuroscience at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Neurobiology, focusing on how synaptic mechanisms might contribute to neuronal death. A major focus of his clinical research career was to develop measures in patients that reflect the underlying biology of their conditions. This led to the development and validation of imaging techniques, including magnetic resonance spectroscopy in Huntington's disease, diffusion-perfusion MR, and CT, X-ray angiography and perfusion imaging in stroke. These stroke imaging tools are now commonplace in stroke care. Guided by these tools, he pioneered acute clot removal for acute stroke patients with large artery occlusion, which is now practiced at comprehensive stroke centers around the country. We appreciate you joining us today, and now I will turn it over to you, Dr. Koroshetz, to give an overview of NINDS's current activities. When you're finished with your presentation, Brittany will open it up to our audience for questions.
Thanks so much, Katie. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk to you by speaking generally about NIH's efforts in combating the pandemic, and most of the time talking about the new effort, which is to understand and hopefully treat what we call the post-acute sequelae of COVID-19. So next slide, please. So I'm sure a number of the previous speakers have talked about the different types of research that NIH has been doing in COVID, focusing on therapeutics, diagnostics, the natural history of the disease, basic research about the virus, how it affects the body, developing research resources, and particularly in developing vaccines. Next slide. And you go right to the next slide. This has been very much organized within NIH under what's called ACTIVE, stands for Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines. And it's led by an executive committee with Francis Collins, the director at NIH, and Paul Stoffels, the director at Johnson & Johnson. Number of high leadership members from the FDA, industry, and NIH. Then it's broken down into different working groups, the preclinical working group, the therapeutics working group, a group working on developing clinical trials and coordinating them, and a vaccine working group. I've been able to work with the therapeutics and the clinical trial working group, and initially and still there's a huge effort in vaccines, particularly now trying to develop vaccines for that are more customized to the new variants. The group has also worked on and tested antiviral agents. There's a number of them that have shown some benefit in preclinical studies, and we're still looking to test further antiviral agents. Monoclonal antibodies and convalescent serum has been tested, and looks like it's helpful in the very early stages of the disease, not so much in the later stages of the disease. We've worked on immunomodulators because COVID is a viral illness, but it triggers a tremendous inflammatory response in some people. And the thought is that that inflammatory response actually can lead to severe disability and even death. So trying to modulate that, dexamethasone, a steroid, and shown to effective. A number of other neuromodulators are also in trials to see if they can add efficacy there. And from my personal area of interest, which was stroke, we have been working with the ACTIVE group and NHLBI in testing antithrombotic therapy in persons with COVID because of that high incidence of clotting that goes on during the acute disease. And what we've learned, which will carry over into the next discussion, is that the patient groups are really important. So people who are in the intensive care unit are in a class by themselves. People in hospitalized but not in intensive care unit are a different class. And people who are able to get through the disease at home are in a third class. And that's the largest group, is people who are developed COVID but do not require hospitalization. So next slide. The issue in terms of the post-acute sequelae is that the largest number of people who are complaining of symptoms are those who are not hospitalized. Now, that's the largest number because that's the greatest cadre. But pretty much all people who required intensive care unit of care, particularly with ARDS, even without COVID, their recovery is a very long recovery that stretches many months and actually even out past a year. So that was quite expected. In people who are hospitalized, the period of time to recover is also seemingly prolonged over what one might expect. But the big surprise is that people who did not require hospitalization, some of those folks are still suffering weeks and now 6, 7 months after the onset of the infection. Now, how to track this down? It's going to require a major effort because we have so many different culprits to go after, because COVID-19 affects multiple organ systems in the body, as you see here. And each of these could be potentially harboring either active virus or inactive virus, or some triggers to continued immune system activation, leading to some of the symptoms we'll talk about later, which are the longer term symptoms. Next slide. In the brain, what we know so far from people who've died with COVID, so these people die with acute COVID. I want to emphasize that we don't have good data from people who've died with months after COVID. But the thing about this study from Dr. Nath at NIH is that some of the people died outside the hospital of sudden death and were found to have COVID when they were investigated for the cause of death. So they probably did not have ICU level. They did not have ICU level infection, but they died of something else. Not clear what that was in many of these instances. But what we found, and what other people have found, is that it's very hard to see virus in the brain. And so that's the good news, that the virus did not seem to be getting into brain cells in a big way. There are a couple of reports from Germany claiming that they can see virus in the olfactory bulb, which is connected to the nose through the olfactory nerves. And so there is some concern that virus could enter the brain through the nose. We know the nose is affected by COVID. That's why people lose their sense of smell, because it affects the nasal mucosa. But even this is still controversial. What is more commonly seen is what we call breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. So you see here in these slides, this greenish area. This is leakage of material from the blood out into the brain. This should not occur. The brain has a very tight barrier separating the brain substance from what's in the blood, but this appears to be broken down in certain cases, particularly in the brain stem of people. And this is followed by inflammatory cells, seen here, these dark dots, which then also escape from the bloodstream and then enter the brain tissue around the blood vessels. The actual effect of this on brain function is not well known, although there are certainly a number of brainstem problems that people have with COVID, particularly this issue of being very hypoxic but not feeling short of breath. Are they somehow disconnected because of this brainstem involvement? Not entirely clear. People with COVID acute infection can have seizures and very commonly have a delirium, a really altered mental state. But this is what we know so far about the virus in the brain. Next slide. We have set up a data bank for neurological complications of COVID at NYU, and we're collecting data now on pretty much all the kind of things that doctors have seen. Besides what I mentioned, there are also some fairly unique, very rare conditions that have been seen, which are not uncommon after an acute inflammatory infection, things like Guillain-Barré, transverse myelitis, multiple sclerosis-like lesions. These have been seen in many other viral outbreaks. Next slide. But luckily, they seem to be rare. Now, in terms of the recovery from COVID, we really got a picture of this in the summer when the CDC released this data showing people who were symptomatic but did not require hospitalization, had a positive test, and they followed them for about 3 weeks. And what they find is that there's about 35% have not returned to baseline, and 19% of them were not able to return to work. And in contrast, if we look at the data from influenza, you expect 90% of the people to recover within this time period. And these are the symptoms. We'll be talking about these again. Fatigue is number one, cough, headache, body aches, fever, chills, loss of taste, loss of smell, GI problems, congestion in the chest, shortness of breath, nausea, sore throat, chest pain, abdominal pain, confusion, which we'll talk about later. It's probably not exactly confusion, it's more memory and concentration problems. Next slide. So this was 35% at 3 weeks for non-hospitalized people. For hospitalized people, next slide, please. The reports out of Europe were about 50% of people who required hospitalization were still symptomatic at about 3 months afterwards. In all these instances, the symptoms in the patients are still getting better, but it's seemingly now that we're out this long, it does appear that some people are still not better out 6 to 7 months after the infection. We don't know exactly what the numbers are right now for the different groups, however. So as I said, we went through these. There are neurologic symptoms, there's cardiac pulmonary symptoms, there's significant mental health symptoms. One can certainly understand someone who was infected, maybe their parent was affected and died, other people in their family were infected. The stress of this virus is not to be underestimated. You have a condition you thought you were getting better, and now months later you're not. We don't have good answers from the medical side, causing a lot of anxiety and depression. So these are the components of the syndrome that we're looking at now. Next slide. This is a recent paper that came out to give a little bit of a sense of what the numbers are. So this is a study from the VA. It's an electronic health record study. What they're looking at, because it's electronic health record, is just the kind of new diagnoses that people have who've been infected with COVID compared to millions of people in the VA system who are not infected with COVID. And as you can see here, they color coded as to those, well, everybody who's positive, and then green. The brown is people who are hospitalized for COVID, and the purple are people in intensive care unit for COVID. So as you would expect, the worse your disease was, the greater the excess burden of any of these symptoms. And these are the ones we saw before. These are the neurologic symptoms we saw before. There's also a lot of pain, sleep disorder, headache, memory problems, and anxiety and depression. So these are significant differences over what would have expected in the VA population if you've had COVID in the past. And this is now out 1 to 6 months after the COVID infection. And I think that just came out last week. So this is kind of the most recent data, which is indicating that those symptoms we talked about, they are persisting and they can be seen in large numbers of people. Next slide. There's also another very large electronic health record study, similarly looking at new diagnoses, psychiatric diagnoses. What they find here, they're comparing it to influenza, what you'd expect after influenza versus COVID. So you can see here for any psychiatric illness, mood disorder, anxiety disorder, there's a much greater impact of COVID in new diagnoses in these classes than one would expect, say, in comparison to the flu. Next slide. So we have a lot to understand about this. We need to know what is the spectrum of clinical recovery. Some people, recover quite well, others don't, and some seemingly are slowing down their recovery period months later. We really want to know what interventions will enhance or hasten recovery. Most likely, if we're going to be effective in helping people, the earlier the interventions are applied, the more effective they're likely to be. We don't know what the spectrum of tissue injury due to COVID is. We know that it can affect the heart, the brain, the lungs. What happens to the heart, brain, lungs, 3 or 6 months after infection. And then we need to know whether there will be a chronic illness in a subset of people. If so, what is its pathophysiology? How do we get to the drivers of the vulnerability or resilience in these folks, children, as well as the elderly? to be able to understand enough to develop a rational treatment. And then something we need to do. There's no real information yet, but because it's affected so many millions of people, it's really on us to try to set up to look at and see if there are effects of this pandemic on the long-term health of the country. Are you more likely to develop dementia or heart disease, for instance? Next slide. So what we have done, and thank goodness for the support of the Congress, who appropriated $1.15 billion to this project, is to really understand and determine how to treat what we call the post-acute sequelae of COVID. So the terminology, just to mention that people with the illness may use one term, long COVID or long hauler, and that I think is addressing the symptoms that we talked about, but post-acute sequelae is an umbrella term that also gets at the other questions like the long-term health of the country, the recovery of different organs that were injured during acute COVID, for instance. So we want to understand the clinical spectrum of the biology underlying recovery, why some don't recover as well. You need to know a lot more about the incidence, prevalence, natural history, and the different subtypes and their different biological drivers. And we need to know whether there's something that's happened during COVID that increased the risk of developing other disorders. Next slide. So what we've done is put out a call for groups of researchers, and we've had a really robust response. And what we're going to do is build a group of patients who have COVID now and then follow them how they recover. And then a group of patients who had COVID and are still symptomatic and try and study those folks. And these are the multiple different cohorts that will be funded as part of this initiative. Some of these cohorts will be studied, say, heavily in the cardiac space or the mental health or the neuro space or the GI or kidney space, but they'll all have some of the studies done in common, so we compare across the cohorts and get, say, for instance, natural history of the syndrome, independent of what the investigators propose to do to understand their piece of the puzzle. Next slide. And so we have what we call, with all these cohorts coming together, a meta cohort, which is the whole group of multiple cohorts, supplemented by studies from electronic health records, like the ones we mentioned from the VA, that can give us, large numbers of patients studied at the electronic health record. So not a deep dive into their issues, but looking at long-term consequences to be set up, for 10 years worth of work. And also we're very, very importantly need to study the autopsies of people who've died. Usually we don't think they're going to die of the post-acute sequelae COVID. They may die of something else though. But they, within those folks, might be the clues as to what the virus is doing or has done that causes persistent symptoms. So there's also a component there. Next slide. And so these recovery cohorts will be patients, very diverse subjects, and the investigators themselves will be brought together to develop a team approach to the problem, because really here we're starting in a space that we don't have a precedent. We don't really have a lot of clues. And so we need everybody working together, bring their best ideas to the table, sharing to kind of get to the answers. And we will have an infrastructure with core resources, clinical centers, data centers, biorepositories that will allow research on these cohorts and the samples to be done by people across the country. Next slide. And the timeline is pretty fast, and we actually are pretty close to being able to issue awards. We hope to get awards out and launch this study within the month. If not within this month, hopefully the first week of June. Next slide. And we will have very robust communication with people who are suffering from this illness and patient engaged at all aspects of the development of the studies. So that's what the initiative looks like now. And it's really exciting how people come forward. And we're really excited about trying to really understand what's going on in this condition. and hoping we can get some solutions. So thank you very much and happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Koroshetz. So we have a few minutes for some questions. Feel free to put any questions that you have in the Q&A function, and we will get to as many as we can. Look forward to your answers. I will get us started, looking to see if there are any open ones. So the pandemic forced many researchers to shut down their labs. As you know, all of us were at home for the first part of last year. And this caused major disruptions in NINDS-focused research that were already in progress. I know that you've been offering flexibilities and no-cost extensions and other things where possible, but you're limited by your budget unless Congress provides some additional funds later on. Can you share some examples of some of the ways that research has been impacted and what the short or long-term consequences will be for the workforce and for advances specifically in your field?
Right. So yeah, it's been a very difficult year for everyone, and particularly the people in research have had their labs closed down. Many of them are now here at NIH. We're up to about 50% opening. You know, people doing shifts, keeping the density of people down in the laboratories. And so that has certainly hurt, really, I mean, there's no way around it. That's had tremendous negative effect on advancing science over the last year. Thinking about what to do, you know, without additional funds, it was very hard to see how we could fairly make up for the damage that was done by the virus. And we had the option of basically taking funds from new grants and it's kind of halting our process of awarding new grants. And the thought was that would be even more disruptive. So the thought is that the people in the NIH system, people are competing against a pool that's been not perfectly, but closely impacted similarly. So the thought is that there's a little bit of a leveling in the grant process that we have. And in fact, we received more grants during COVID than we did before COVID. So people are definitely writing grants. And so we thought that the best thing to do was just continue to review and fund those grants. We haven't really slowed down at that at all. Now, it's not entirely true that it's a level playing field because some people are more adversely affected than others. You know, women with children, single parents, investigators whose parents were sick and they had to take care of them. And these things we can't really make right. What we have tried to do is to put some funding to help trainees who are caught in the transition. Postdocs who had a grant from us and can't get a job, we've actually paid to extend their fellowships and then to extend the window for eligibility for the different transitions from PhD to postdoc, a postdoc to faculty position. And some of those have gotten also funding to lengthen that transition period that was slowed.
Okay. So do you think that there has been there will be consequences into the future, or you've mostly mitigated them, it sounds like, or you've tried to at least?
No, I think, it's kind of like, it was like a health event that occurred to the research enterprise, just like it does to a person. And so if you're sick for 6 months, you're out of work, you're not productive for that 6 months, and then you come back and get going again. I think that's the analogy. We probably lost a year worth of research due to the pandemic, for the whole enterprise.
Okay.
I don't see how we can make that up though.
I guess that will be the question into, maybe we'll ask you in 10 years what the impacts were. How has the NINDS's efforts to address COVID-19 positively impacted the Institute's work in other areas of neurological diseases and disorders?
Well, I think the really interesting thing, we were talking before we came on, is that the pandemic has changed a lot of things, and although the probably impact has been negative, we have learned some lessons that I think could apply to the future. So, in terms of COVID, I think that we should develop more of BSL-3 facilities for animal testing of dangerous viruses. That these are rare, but when a pandemic hits, you really need them to be able to safely test the virus, say, in animal models. I think, and also, the clinical trial work that went on, I think it was as well organized as it could, but our system of healthcare is not really conducive to bringing the whole nation to do research in a coordinated fashion, say, as for instance the United Kingdom can do. So one question that comes up is whether the country should build that kind of infrastructure that is always busy but can turn on a dime in case of an emergency. The institutes have their own networks that were brought in to work on COVID. So you had, say, for instance, the Cardiothoracic Surgery Research Network did great work in COVID, but those were kind of serendipity more than planned, engineered, large clinical trials. So I think people are thinking in that direction. For NINDS, we've struggled with, there are multiple viruses that affect the brain. Most of them are rare, but they are devastating to the brain. And we don't have good diagnostic tests. We don't have good antivirals. And because they were not that common, there weren't companies interested in developing treatments for these viruses. But the question on my mind is, now that we have these companies and they've shown that they can turn on a dime to develop an antiviral, can we just use that technology for some of these other things like West Nile virus, equine encephalitis, Powassan's encephalitis? And then the other big issue is that, as I mentioned in the talk, there are a number of neurologic conditions that occur in the post-inflammatory state, and we don't understand them very well. COVID gives us an opportunity, because there's so many people infected, it's kind of a natural experiment to try and understand how this actually happens, and particularly for the condition called ME/CFS, or chronic fatigue syndrome. That is very similar to the symptoms that I described. Those people are sick for years and years, and can never figure out what caused it or how it got started. But this is an opportunity to do that, because this looks a lot like that. So we could figure out what is the trigger, the biological trigger for the post-acute COVID. I think that would likely have significant implications for this chronic fatigue syndrome that we work on.
Great. So we are over time, but we have a little bit of extra time built in. So if folks need to drop off, we say goodbye, thank you, but we're going to keep going for a few minutes. but if people need to drop off, we recognize that it is 3:30. But we have so many good questions coming in. We're going to just go another 10 minutes or so. So how has the pandemic influenced the strategic priorities of NINDS? And what do you think the biggest issue is going forward? And what resources do you need to accomplish that?
Right. Well, I think I was hitting on a couple of things that COVID taught us that have, changed our thinking in terms of how we're going to strategically move against some of these other viruses, some of these other post-inflammatory conditions. Try to reach out to companies that have developed these technologies to diagnose viruses and see if we can kind of convince them to work on some of the rare neurological viruses. So I think that's one strategic lesson that we learned. And I mean, the other lesson is that, and this is a a question for NIH in general and the country in general, really, is that what the pandemic showed us was that with the kind of organization that Active came with, you had industry, you had FDA, you have NIH, they were all devoted to work on one problem. And it's pretty amazing that we got a virus and that's a vaccine in that short a time, and some of these other treatments in such a short time. It's evidence of what a multidisciplinary group can do working together against a problem. Now, this has been a war, and when the war is over, we all have our battles that we have to fight. We've been actually fighting them even during the middle of the war on other diseases like Parkinson's disease, or Alzheimer's, or stroke, or epilepsy. But there's going to be a lot of envy. What if we had 5 companies at the table and the FDA working on Parkinson's disease, like with the same kind of urgency that occurred in the pandemic. So I think that model, I'm hoping that model, although it'll be scaled down because there's just so many different conditions to go after, but I'm hopeful that model might be strategically an improvement for the future. We have these programs called the Accelerated Medicine Partnerships that Dr. Collins runs, and they are industry and academia with FDA at the table, working on a problem. So we have them in Parkinson's, as you know, we have one in Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, and whether these can be, kind of jacked up and put on steroids to solve problems, I think is something I certainly would like to see happen.
Great. Here's kind of a practical one that came in. Are there discussions about extending currently funded grant for an additional year or whatever is necessary for that particular grant, or will that require additional appropriations?
No, the NIH right from the beginning developed an incredibly lenient policy for establishing what's called no-cost extensions. So that's been very common that grants will be extended. They weren't given extra money for it, though. The idea was that they would spend less money during the period of time when things were shut down, and then have money to continue after their grant had was going to officially end. So these no-cost extensions are very common.
Okay. Do you think you'll be able to continue? So you'll be able to keep doing that into the future?
Yes.
At least, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, one kind of sciencey question. Have you noticed any synaptic changes in those who have died of COVID, like loss of synapses or effects on axons or density in the brain?
Yeah, really good question. At this point, no one has really done that level of detail work. There are, the exception being the fact that in some of the areas where there's blood-brain barrier breakdown, there's actually hemorrhages. And so when there's a hemorrhage, then there's actually destruction to the cells around the hemorrhage. And also in the postmortem cases, there are also multiple small vessel strokes seen throughout the brain. And there, of course, is damage to the nerve cells that are involved in the ischemic stroke. But in terms of a widespread effect on synapse ultrastructure, no one's actually looked at that yet. We do know that the people with symptoms afterwards, a number of them are cognitively not performing as we would expect them on cognitive tests. So there is clearly something in those folks that is preventing normal information processing in the brain. We don't really have any clue as to what that is at this point.
Okay, I guess future research will let us know.
Yes,
okay, we have time for one more question, and it's we always wrap up with this. What can the advocacy community, your audience here, what can we do to support your work? If you have any additional messages for us, we'd love to hear them.
Right. Well, I think, NIH relies on the investigators out there in universities, and so those investigators clearly suffered during the pandemic. One is worried that particularly young investigators, so a year, if you're investigating, you've been investigating for 30 years, and you have a year of downtime, well, it's 1/30th of your career. If you're a PhD student, it's 20% of your career, and so we're hoping that there's not going to be discouragement that moves people out of science because of the pandemic. And there's not a great deal that NIH can do about that. But I think the advocacy groups are so important in motivating people to go into science and to stick with the problem and to realize that, the pandemic was a health problem and the solution is a scientific solution. And that's true for so many other people in this country, whether you have Parkinson's or stroke or heart disease. And many of those people, as opposed to COVID, most people do get better. But as you know, in Parkinson's, we haven't been able to slow the disease down. So the challenges of the pandemic, there's, if people want a challenge, there's so many challenges in biomedicine, but you have to be devoted to it. And I think that the advocacy groups are the ones who can best kind of develop that culture in the young people, so that they're really attached to this mission that we all feel so passionate about.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Koroshetz. That's all the time we have for questions. And I will end with, may the 4th be with us all, and turn it back to Tanaz.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Brittany. And, Dr. Koroshetz, I think you give the advocacy community a lot of credit for energizing next generation of scientists to go into science careers. But truly, I think the work that you and your colleagues do every day is really what energizes the community to keep pushing forward and to keep making progress in this space. So thank you both for joining us today, but also for all the work that you do every day.
Thanks. We have a great team here. Thank you.
Thank you also to Katie and to Brittany for their help with this briefing, and to everyone who was able to join the discussion today. Mark your calendars for our next briefing on May 13th with the Director of NIDCD, Dr. Deborah Tusi. Hope everybody stays safe and stays well, and thank you again and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.